Given Russia's immense size, it's not at all a surprise that it's populated by 144.6 million people. However, what might catch one off guard is that, in a nation as expansive as Russia, where one might expect a variety of cultures similar to the USA, there are only about 70,000 black people. This figure doesn't even constitute 0.5% of the total population in Russia, where snow blankets the streets and history runs deep. Being black can feel like being the only color in a sea of white. You might have heard the Soviet Union claim to be a haven for oppressed peoples, proudly waving the flag of anti-racism. But the truth is much more complicated. And what about the Afro Russians, those who've lived in this space for generations, and despite being a minority, played a vital role in shaping Russian history and society? Stay with us until the end as we explore the answers to these questions. But before discussing the plight of Afro Russians, let's briefly recap who they are. Who are the Afro Russians? Simply put, Afro Russians are Russians of African descent. According to the Métis Foundation, there were about 30,000 Afro Russians as of 2013, predominantly residing in cities like Moscow, Astrakhan, and Ekaterinburg. That number has now evolved to almost 70,000. One of the most famous Afro Russians was Abram Ganable. If you're familiar with Russian literature, you might recognize the name. Ganable was the great-grandfather of the poet Alexander Pushkin. Born in Africa, he was kidnapped by Ottoman forces and eventually ended up in the Russian court of Peter the Great. Ganable rose to prominence as a military leader and nobleman, different kind of colonialism. All right, now it's time for a history lesson in Russian history. Remember when European nations were entangled in colonialism and the transatlantic slave trade? Russia's story took a different path. There's no dark legacy of slavery or colonization like in the US, France, or Spain. Russia's history with black communities has a completely different twist, one shaped by invitations, unique alliances, and sometimes surprising contradictions. In Europe, black servants were often brought to royal courts as exotic symbols, objects of fascination, particularly for women confined to royal quarters. Russia, too, saw black individuals in a similar light. But unlike in the West, black people who arrived in Russia weren't seen primarily as a labor force or slaves. During the Soviet era, black people were invited as comrades, scholars, and allies, not as enslaved laborers. This wasn't a relationship based on the violence of the slave trade, but rather on shared ideals, especially during the Cold War. Black students from Africa and other regions were offered educational opportunities, and Russia positioned itself as a place free from Western imperialism and racial oppression. One key distinction in this narrative is that Russia never participated in the transatlantic slave trade, which shaped how black people were viewed in the country. In fact, in 1842, Russia officially outlawed slavery, and any enslaved Africans brought to the country were declared free. In the 1960s and 70s, when thousands of Africans flocked to Soviet universities like the People's Friendship University of Russia, this cultural exchange led to the emergence of a unique community, including what became known as festival children, a term referring to mixed-race kids born to Soviet citizens and individuals from Africa, Asia, or Latin America. The Soviet Union marketed itself as a land free from racism, attracting many African Americans who viewed Russia as an escape from the oppressive realities of Jim Crow laws. But fast forward to December 1963 and the death of Ghanaian medical student Edmund Aserato ignited one of the largest protests of that era, with 500 African students marching through Moscow demanding justice. Their signs read "Stop Killing Africans," and they likened Moscow to the segregationist American South, dubbing it a second Alabama, from Comrade to Outcast. But that was just the tip of the iceberg. Fast forward to 2006, and reports from exchange students revealed that derogatory monkey insults were so rampant that they stopped reporting them altogether. African students were frequently accused of stealing white Soviet women, which sometimes led to violence, and Edmund Aserato's mysterious death was also rumored to involve a white Soviet woman. African students who traveled to the USSR seeking a safe haven from racism found themselves protesting against the very injustices they thought they had escaped. This moment was the moment that clearly showed the divide between the Soviet Union's self-proclaimed anti-racist ideals and the lived experiences of its African residents. African students experienced harassment, discrimination, and even violence in their daily lives. Many felt the need to carry knives for protection, and they often encountered offensive racial stereotypes. And not just that, even the experiences of Africans and African Americans were vastly different. While African Americans like Langston Hughes and Paul Robeson were treated with some level of respect, Africans from newly decolonized nations faced overt hostility. Why? Because African Americans were viewed as representatives of the United States, while Africans were often seen as needing Soviet guidance. This paradox ran deep. African students were given scholarships and privileges that even Soviet citizens didn't have, but they were also subjected to racist slurs and physical assaults. With the fall of the Soviet Union came a significant shift. As economic hardships emerged, xenophobia grew, and Afro Russians became targets of rising nationalist sentiments. Although Russia never institutionalized racism to the extent seen elsewhere, many Black Russians still face daily challenges. From being denied service in bars and taxis to being treated as outsiders despite being born and raised in Russia, these everyday acts of discrimination accumulate, creating an invisible yet pervasive barrier. But the challenges don't end there. Many African migrants arrive in Russia seeking education and job opportunities, only to find themselves ensnared in cycles of fraud, exploitation, and even human trafficking. Every year, thousands of women, especially from Nigeria, are lured to Russia with false promises of student visas or employment, only to be trapped in rings. Point one step forward, two steps back. On a positive note, in 2010, Jean Sagbo made history as the first Black man elected to a government position in Russia. He became a municipal councillor in the village of Novozavidovo, about 100 kilometers north of Moscow. But the struggle against racism has continued. In 2013, member of Duma Irina Rodnina faced backlash for tweeting a photo of President Obama with a banana. And it didn't stop there. In Tatarstan, a supermarket sold calendars depicting Obama as a monkey and initially refused to apologize for it. They eventually had to issue a public apology after facing severe backlash. Things got even weirder in mid-2016 when a Tatarstan ice cream factory launched a product called Obamka, which means Little Obama. The packaging featured a black child wearing an earring, and while the company claimed it wasn't political, many saw it as a mix of anti-American sentiment and lingering Soviet-era racism. The production was halted shortly after the controversy erupted, but it really shows that these issues are far from resolved. Racism in modern-day Russia. Today, the challenges for Black individuals in Russia are still ongoing, with racism manifesting in popular culture and daily interactions. Incidents, such as the death of Zambian student Lemakani Nirenda, who reportedly was recruited into the Wagner Group and killed in Ukraine, highlight that these issues persist. While the Black Lives Matter movement sparked global conversations about race, many people of color living in Russia have shared their experiences of daily discrimination. Many real-life stories shed light on this very real problem. One of them is Roy Ibanga, a 21-year-old economics student from the Congo. In 2017, he moved to Bryansk, Russia, where he quickly faced the harsh reality of racism. He posted a video of a taxi driver refusing him a ride, stating outright, "If I don't like a person, I won't give them a ride. It's my car." But Roy isn't alone. Many others have faced similar situations. Like Isabel Castillo, a 27-year-old marketing manager, who shared how she was treated poorly in school because of her skin color. She was bullied because she looked different, even in one of the best schools. And when she moved to St. Petersburg, things improved, until she faced racism again while trying to rent a flat in Moscow. Many landlords would say Slavs only in their ads, disregarding her qualifications because of her name. Maxim Nikolsky, a 24-year-old journalist, also opened up about the casual racism he faced growing up, making school a challenging environment for him. It became so bad that people would often move away from him on the metro. Then we have Kamila Ogun, a 21-year-old basketball player who moved to Moscow from a small town. While she found more acceptance in the capital, she still faced impolite questions about her background. Discrimination is still a reality for many Afro Russians, and social movements have emerged to push back against that. One group, the Sputnik Association, was founded in London to connect Afro Russians living abroad and celebrate their unique heritage. So, as we've seen, being black in Russia comes with unique challenges, ones that aren't often talked about in the global conversation on race. From the legacies of African students during the Soviet Union to the experiences of Afro Russians today, it's clear that this is a complex story shaped by history, politics, and cultural dynamics. Let's keep the conversation going in the comments below. Tell us how you think the global fight against racism can evolve to include voices from countries like Russia. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more, and click that notification bell so you don't miss out on future videos.